Hello everybody, welcome back with another video. Today we are back with episode 0.4 of the Pacific War by Kings and Generals. So yes, I know it's my birthday. Yes, I'm now 15 and yeah, I'm getting old. So yeah folks, today I wanted to celebrate my birthday by reacting to How America Became an Empire by Kings and Generals. This is my first time reacting to this, so like and subscribe. This is episode 0.4 and the next video is going to be episode 0.5 of our series in the Pacific War. So let's get right to the video. Okay, so I'm going to start my recording by pressing this record button in Bcame. And here we go. We are recording. So we all know how America became an empire, and it's because of Manifest Destiny. If you don't know what Manifest Destiny is, we're going to learn about that in this video. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna arrange my camera. There we go. So yeah, this is my first time. I still have the coughs, I still have the sore throat, and yeah, I'm very sorry if I cough in this video. So yeah. Let's get right to the video. Wait, hold on. Jeez, it's been a while. Calm down, bro. Okay.
So far in this series, we've been mainly covering the history of the Japanese Empire prior to the start of the Pacific War. But what about the other major player of the war? What was the position of the United States after the end of World War I? What were their interests and strategies in the Pacific? And how did they feel about their future rival and its rise as a great power? Today we're going to answer all these questions and more as we cover the history of the United States and its role in the Pacific Theater. And if you're interested in the history of the world wars...
Yes, I'm interested, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna skip this. Okay, hold on. Okay, over here. So, we all know what Manifest Destiny is, and if you don't know what Manifest Destiny, we might learn it in this video. If Kings and Generals didn't mention about Manifest Destiny, I'm going to look it up in Google.
By clicking on the link in the description, you won't regret it. Magellan TV is great.
USA in the Pacific, episode 0.4.
Since its inception, one of the primary objectives of the United States has been to secure America's commercial interests in the world, without hesitation to use force to preserve its trade, and only bothering to intervene in conflicts if they impede American profits. Yet expansionism wasn't rare in the early history of the US, albeit not by force of arms in most cases. Following independence, the Manifest Destiny doctrine urged Americans to expand in a westward direction until getting to the Pacific Ocean. With the purchase of Alaska, westward expansion finally ended, but the Manifest Destiny did not.
Yes, it did not end there. Even though they got all of the land in whole America and Alaska, Manifest Destiny didn't end. It still expanded until the countries that was affected by the Manifest Destiny got their independence. So yeah, I don't know if it's the end though. We don't know.
As in the late 19th century, it evolved to promote an overseas expansion directed to the acquisition of Pacific Island groups.
Hawaii.
Commercial interests in the Far East also helped to fuel this extension of the Manifest Destiny, with the US participating in the forced establishment of trade in China, Japan and Korea via the unequal treaties through the decades. As the United States resisted getting itself entangled in Europe's perennial wars, A sphere of influence was gradually created over its own continent, and the US soon started to grow as a world power. This sphere of influence then expanded into the Pacific, where the Americans found great interests on the Hawaiian archipelago, which would eventually cause the collapse of the Kingdom of Hawaii and its subsequent annexation by the US, an event that coincided with the outbreak of war with the Spanish Empire over Cuba.
Yeah, Spanish-American War. I actually heard about a fact. Correct me if I'm wrong, Theodore Roosevelt fought in Cuba. Correct me if I'm wrong. I just heard about that rumor. I don't know if it's a rumor or fact. I just heard about that. I don't know if it's a rumor or if it's a fact. So, guys, correct me if I'm wrong.
From this war, the United States also obtained the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific, yet these territories were not to be new states. Instead, they were basically declared as colonies, not enjoying full constitutional rights under American rule. The newly born American imperialism in the Pacific would continue with the colonization of the eastern islands of Samoa and the main islands surrounding Hawaii. In East Asia, the Americans opted to cede the initiative to the Europeans, with the objective of securing the little presence they had in the region, while at the same time helping important states like Japan or China to modernize and thus become a counterweight to European encroachment. In result, relationships with the Qing dynasty and the early Meiji government were very amicable, with the US promising to intercede on their behalf in the face of renewed European aggression. But when the Japanese Empire quickly began to manifest its own imperial ambitions, the Americans had to act to prevent war between Japan and China, consequently damaging American-Japanese relations. After
They stopped importing oil. And oil is very, very important to Japan's imperial expedition through China. So, because of that, they might have think of attacking Pearl Harbor. I don't know, that's a little bit later in history. But I learned that America stopped importing oil to Japan so that it stopped their expedition through China. So that's the only education that I know in this time.
After the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War, however, the US helped to broker peace between them with the Treaty of Shimonoseki and refused to join the Europeans during the Triple Intervention, again becoming one of the friendliest powers to Japan. In 1899, after a scramble for concessions in China, the Secretary of State John Hay established a new American foreign policy aimed towards East Asia. With the open door policy, the US wanted to preserve Chinese territorial and administrative integrity as a buffer against intensifying conflicts in the region and to secure American commercial, rail and navigational access to Chinese markets. This skillful articulation of US interests probably slowed imperial expansion within China during and after the Boxer Rebellion, yet it wouldn't be enough to deter Russian and Japanese aggression, leading to the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Once again, the Americans would have to intervene to end the war and maintain a favorable balance of power in the region during the negotiations at the Treaty of Portsmouth.
Theodore Roosevelt.
The very restrained peace terms negotiated by President Theodore Roosevelt strongly damaged American-Japanese relations, as Roosevelt supported the defeated Russians in their stance to concede little territory and to avoid war reparations. The Japanese expected these reparations to help families recover from lost fathers and sons, and to relieve the burden of heavy taxation. Without them, social unrest erupted in the country. Roosevelt did this because he wanted the war to end with both Russia and Japan in a weak state. Russia humiliated and militarily weak, and Japan bankrupt and with unrest. The Japanese, however, managed to recover from the economic crisis and continued to modernize, as we've already seen. Worried about Japan's growing naval power after the war, the Roosevelt administration set out to improve its defenses in the Pacific and to embark on a large naval buildup capable of defending Pacific possessions from Japanese aggression.
There you go. By 1907, the Navy was building 29 vessels against the 13 ships under construction by Japan. This is may actually be the time where maybe the Pearl Harbor got built. I don't know. My guess is this is the time where Pearl Harbor was built, 1907. That's just
in the
guess.
remainder of Roosevelt's presidency, an effort was made to improve relations with the Japanese, but despite the successes that American diplomats might have had, everything would change after the outbreak of the First World War. From it, the United States emerged as a great power, playing a key part in the collapse of the German Empire at the end of the war. But despite President Woodrow Wilson's goal of world peace with the establishment of the League of Nations, his foreign policy in the Pacific would be poor and inconsistent. It was during this time that American-Japanese relations reached a point of no return, as the US condemned the 21 demands presented by the Japanese to China in an effort to increase their sphere of influence in the region. The growing tensions between Japan and the US then reached a climax at Versailles, forcing the Allied nations to strike a compromise during the peace negotiations. In exchange for the German leases in China and their colonies in Micronesia, the racial equality proposal presented by the Japanese would be rejected.
First of all, for me, Treaty of Versailles helped the Nazis. Helped the Nazis rose to power because the Treaty of Versailles actually damaged Germany. They were left in the poor state because of this stupid treaty. This treaty gave us Adolf Hitler. For me. You guys can say so some reasons, but for me, the Treaty of Versailles gave us Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party.
Mainly due to the opposition of the British and the US itself. This compromise was seen as a humiliation by both the Chinese, who believed that the German leases should return to them, and the Japanese, who felt alienated by the Western powers, and in response suffered a rise of nationalism and anti-American sentiment. Overall, however, Wilson would maintain the open-door policy towards China in a more friendly way and would succeed at supporting democracy and self-determination in Asia and the Pacific, even going so far as to propose the decolonization of the Philippines. But the devastation of the Great War had an unforeseen consequence. It left only the US and the Japanese Empire as the main players in the Pacific. To preserve the open door, the Americans would now have to balance their own power in the region and that of Japan, and to increase the difficulty of their task, the Republic of China would also fracture into several warlord states, so the open door was detrimental for Chinese territorial integrity. Meanwhile, the American Navy had been preparing for war with the Japanese Empire since the start of the century, developing and adapting their War Plan Orange through the years. Their plan initially involved the defense of their Pacific possessions from their base at Corregidor Island.
Wow, that's the first time I know that. So, even before, they were preparing to go toward to Empire of the Japan. I didn't know that. This is their War Plan of Orange. The defense of the Philippines. Okay, this is not the defense of the Philippines that we saw. I made a series, the defense of the Philippines. I didn't finish it because it got me just a few views, but I saw that and it was like the defense of the Philippines when Japan got all of this, like some, not all of them, but some huge chunk of China. and some parts of the Chino. I don't know, what was it? The French. Ah, God, I forgot. Hold on.
While waiting for reinforcements to arrive from the Atlantic, as the US expected a sudden Japanese attack. Then advancing up the Caroline and Marshall Islands in preparation for a decisive counterattack against the Japanese Navy, the Americans would take Japan's home islands under blockade and then end the war. Thus, for the success of War Plan Orange, continued parity with the IJN in the Pacific and the fortification of US Pacific possessions was of absolute importance. If the Americans neglected these endeavors, they would then throw away an invaluable military advantage and risk prolongation of war, maximum expenditure, and uncertainty of outcome. But the Roaring Twenties were a time of great prosperity for the US, one in which naval spending had very little support, as the Republican governments instead focused on business prospects. By the end of the decade, the Americans had become the largest exporter in the world, expanding the size of its domestic market and becoming less dependent on trade, and to avoid a costly naval arms race with Japan, the US would turn to convene an international disarmament conference in Washington. Furthermore, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 was an important matter for the Americans, so they would pressure Great Britain to terminate the treaty, leaving Japan alone and isolated. As such, they would be easily pressured into agreeing with the Washington Naval Treaty. The treaty itself, signed in 1922, established a 5-5-3 ratio in battleship tonnage for the US, Britain and Japan, as well as a non-fortification clause in the Pacific. It also enforced the open door policy by making all the powers guarantee the commercial and territorial integrity of China. The treaty was thus a great success, securing American superiority against the IJN and managing to soothe Japanese aggression against China for the remainder of the decade. Yet in the long term, the treaty would render War Plan Orange completely ineffective, as the non-fortification clause left the US at a severe disadvantage in the Pacific, and in the 30s, Japan would begin to build up its navy again to compete with the US and to establish hegemony in East Asia.
First of all, Japan's navy in the Pacific War was good. It was amazing. They actually paired to the U.S. naval fleet, and I'm impressed in Japan at this time because they were mobilizing, trying to compete to this new and improved country that is getting its name to the world, that they're going to be the next superpower. And look at this. The Circle Plans were a series of naval construction programs that granted air superiority and naval parity with the US to the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. Like Japan in this time was amazing at mobilizing. Like, I'm pretty impressed.
The Japanese would also see the growth of anti-American sentiment with the Japanese Exclusion Act of 1924, which closed off Japanese immigration to the US. This act further provoked the rise of ultranationalism and racist-driven fascism in the Japanese Empire.
Okay, we learned that from the last video, and okay, so because of the Japanese Exclusion Act, that's the reason why there's going to be the rise of the ultranationalism and some fascism,
which would eventually lead to the decision to abandon disarmament and to prepare for war against the US. For the remainder of the decade, the US would try to financially support Japan to heal a little their poor relationship, but with the signing of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which further established limitations on cruiser and submarine construction, the ultranationalists in Japan finally began their rise to power. The prosperous Roaring Twenties would also end very poorly, with the Wall Street crash of 1929 signaling the beginning of the
Great Depression. Okay. 1929. The Wall Street crash. This was signed in London Naval Treaty of 1930, and the Wall Street crash happened in 1929. And that's another reason. The Great Depression helped the Nazis rose to power. I know the Nazi Germany isn't really in the subject, but remember, the Pacific War is inside of World War II, because World War II is like every country is at war. That's the reason why it's called World War, and it's World War II. And obviously we're gonna include Nazi Germany and Italy, now in Japan. So that's the worst end of the 20s.
The Wall Street crash of 1929 signaling the beginning of the Great Depression. What followed was a time of high unemployment, poverty, deflation, emigration and economic crisis, poorly managed by the government of President Herbert Hoover. The 1932 election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, however, saw the establishment of an economic recovery plan, the New Deal, which would allow for much of the economy to recover by 1936.
First of all, I just realized America, the end of Great Depression was very weird. It ended in the start of World War II, or because of World War II, because after this, after the Great Depression, the Nazis came and they started invading countries. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and US got into the war, and like the Great Depression just disappeared out of nowhere. Like that's pretty amazing to know, because a war ended a depression or an economic crash in a country. Like, oh my.
Although the effects of the Great Depression would still be felt for many more years.
No.
In 1937, for example, the American economy would unexpectedly fall again, with a renewed decline of production, profits and employment. FDR reacted by launching a rhetorical campaign against monopoly power and a $5 billion spending program to increase mass purchasing power. Luckily, the 1937 recession had ended by 1939, and the American economy was recovering once again.
Okay, I'm not saying you guys gonna say, wait, the Great Depression didn't end in the start of World War II. For me, it's like a little bit, because of good decisions of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The country got back to its knees, but for me, the Great Depression just disappeared when World War II came. So, yeah.
In the Pacific, meanwhile, the economic turmoil in the US coincided with the consolidation of ultra-nationalist elements in Japan, which launched a successful invasion of Manchuria, left the League of Nations, and abandoned the naval disarmament. Overwhelmed by the financial crisis at home, the Hoover administration wanted no problem with Japan, so they allowed the Japanese to get away with it without enacting economic sanctions against them. As the open door was falling apart, FDR would also focus exclusively on more pressing domestic programs, resulting in the Japanese having a free hand to act in China. Furthermore, the American Navy was in a miserable state, with the Asiatic Squadron still using aged vessels from the Great War. Hoover and FDR would also cut down the Army and Navy budgets, and in Hoover's mandate, not a single ship would be constructed, further weakening the American military. In response, Congressman Carl Vinson, the main champion of a stronger navy during the 30s, would work with Roosevelt's administration to use the naval buildup as a jobs program in accordance with FDR's own policies. Through the Vinson Acts, by 1942, the American Navy had been successfully built back up to the London Treaty limits, which gave a little more confidence for War Plan Orange. But still, Japan held considerable superiority in the Pacific, so the Americans would design the Royal Road, a plan that anticipated a sustained campaign of island hopping, culminating in a decisive fleet engagement and the fall of Japan.
This actually was used, like, when Japan got all of this. They used this island hopping thing. They island hopped here, and the Solomon Islands. Is it Solomon Islands? Here, the Papua Guinea, and just island hopping until they got to the Philippines. And while they were island hopping, there were naval battles over here and near Midway, and yeah, the most notable one is the Battle of Midway. So yeah, the most important military base in Japan. I don't know if it's a military base. Correct me if I'm wrong if it's a military base. But when Japan lost Midway, they were scared of America going to invade the whole country now, the mainland. So but surprisingly, they didn't surrender until the 2 nuclear bombs, and then they surrendered. So yeah.
As we'll see, this plan would become essential during the strategies of the Pacific War.
See, the island hopping. They island hopped over here, this part, not here. They island hopped here.
Next week, however, we'll return to East Asia as we cover the civil strife within China and the outbreak of war with the Japanese Empire.
The Kuomintang. Yeah, the Chinese Civil War. The Kuomintang. The Communist China.
So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely.
So, because of imperialism, the Qing dynasty had collapsed, and they were separated by warlords, and it started a civil war. And the civil war was the communists versus the nationalists. The nationalists was led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists was led by Mao Zedong. And there's this historical march that happened. I forgot what the name was. It was a march where the communists retreated, and hold on, I'm gonna search it up. The Long March most commonly refers to the transfer of the main group of First or Central Red Army, which include the leaders of the CCP, from Yudu in the province of Shaanxi to Yan'an in Shaanxi. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. In this sense, the Long March lasted from October 16, 1934 to October 1935. Wow. That Long March took 1 year and 3 days, because October 16 and October 19. So yeah, that's the Long March, and I'm very, very excited to learn about the Long March, because earlier this day I actually was watching people's profile about Mao Zedong, and he mentioned the Long March. So thank you for watching, everybody. Like and subscribe for more videos like this. I know my voice is very, very low because I'm kind of tired now. So yeah, goodbye.